The Dark Scrolls. They buried the child with the title of Princess, though by then no one could say for certain if she still was one. Her father had cast her aside, her mother died in disgrace, and her name, Mary, became a whisper of what once had been, the golden girl of the Tudor court, now reduced to a symbol of the past that everyone was eager to forget. But Mary Tudor never forgot, and neither did her half-sister, Elizabeth. What began as a silent war of glances across long, candle-lit halls would, over the years, unravel into one of the most poisonous rivalries in royal history. Sisters by blood, enemies by design. Henry VIII, the man who had shattered the Catholic world to birth his own church, left behind more than a trail of broken alliances and severed heads. He left behind 3 children, each born of a different mother, each a living fragment of his conflicting desires. Yet it was Mary and Elizabeth, the 2 daughters, who bore the deepest wounds. One was the child of his dutiful first wife, Catherine of Aragon, the other the brilliant and dangerously captivating Anne Boleyn. And though both girls had once been cast as illegitimate, they were destined to be queens, but not together, never together. Mary was the elder, born to a Spanish mother who never relinquished her Catholic convictions, even as her world fell apart. Catherine of Aragon had been queen in everything but name after Henry sought his infamous divorce. For Mary, this meant humiliation, stripped of her status, forced to serve in the household of her baby sister Elizabeth, the child born of the woman she had been taught to loathe. Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the woman the Pope never recognized as queen, had taken her place not just in the court, but in the king's affections. The household was cold, not just in temperature, but in spirit. Mary, barely in her teens, was made to acknowledge Elizabeth as princess, though in her heart she burned with resentment. Her mother's health waned, and in 1536, Catherine died alone in Kimbolton Castle. Barely 6 months later, Anne Boleyn was executed. Elizabeth, still a toddler, was branded a bastard. But that didn't heal Mary. If anything, it left both girls scarred, 2 motherless daughters of a merciless king, taught to distrust everyone, especially each other. Years passed in quiet torment. Henry remarried again and again, but the daughters remained. When he died in 1547, he left the throne to his only son, Edward VI, a devout Protestant raised to despise the old Catholic ways. At just 9 years old, he ascended to the throne, and it was during his reign that the religious divide between the sisters began to crystallize into dangerous paranoia. Mary clung to her Catholic faith like a lifeline, while Edward's court grew more zealous by the day, eager to reform, purge, and erase the old ways forever. Edward distrusted Mary. Her refusal to abandon Catholic Mass was seen as rebellion. Elizabeth, by contrast, was clever, outwardly compliant, inwardly calculating. She knew how to navigate the shadows, how to survive, and survive she did. When Edward died in 1553, his Protestant allies tried to bypass both Mary and Elizabeth by placing Lady Jane Grey, a Protestant cousin, on the throne. It lasted just 9 days. Mary would not be denied. With the backing of the people, she rode into London like a queen of vengeance. The bells tolled, bonfires blazed, but this triumph was not a fairy tale. It was the beginning of a reign drenched in dread. For Mary would not forget the slights she endured, the humiliation, the heresy, the betrayals. And she would make England Catholic again, even if it bled for it. Her first move, she summoned Elizabeth. The meeting was not one of sisterly warmth. Mary, now queen, knew Elizabeth posed a threat, not just because of her lineage, but because of what she represented. The Protestant hope. Mary demanded her allegiance. Elizabeth gave it, cautiously, diplomatically, with the practiced innocence of a woman who had learned young how to wear a mask. But Mary did not trust her. How could she? She saw in Elizabeth the echo of Anne Boleyn's cunning. She saw the eyes of her father, the glint of ambition. And Elizabeth, in turn, saw in Mary a fanatic cloaked in royal robes, a woman desperate for an heir, desperate for love, desperate to turn back a tide that had already begun to drown her. Then came Wyatt's rebellion in 1554. It was a failed uprising, an attempt to prevent Mary from marrying Philip of Spain, a Catholic match that terrified Protestant nobles. Though Elizabeth's direct involvement was unproven, she was arrested, taken to the Tower of London, and held under suspicion of treason. It was the same tower where her mother had awaited execution. Elizabeth entered with her head held high, but behind her eyes was terror. She was not just fighting for her crown, she was fighting for her life. Mary hesitated. Her advisers urged her to sign the death warrant, but something stopped her. Perhaps it was guilt, perhaps it was the ghost of their father. Perhaps, despite everything, Mary could not bring herself to kill the last living piece of the sister she had once rocked in a cradle. Elizabeth was eventually released, but the wound between them never healed. It festered. Mary's marriage to Philip brought her no joy. He was cold, distant, and spent little time in England. The people resented the Spanish alliance. Worse, Mary's body betrayed her. She suffered phantom pregnancies, her belly swelling, her symptoms convincing even the physicians, only for it all to vanish. No child, no heir, only shame. And through it all, Elizabeth waited, silent, patient, watching as Mary's reign descended into blood and fire. The burnings began, heretics dragged into public squares, tied to stakes, consumed by flames. The people called her Bloody Mary, and the name stuck like soot. Elizabeth knew better than to gloat. She played her part. She attended Mass. She kept her expressions neutral. But in private she studied. She planned. She waited. Mary's health crumbled. Her hopes dimmed. Her dreams of restoring the Catholic faith died one burning corpse at a time. And then, finally, in 1558, she died, childless, alone, unloved. The crown passed to Elizabeth, but the past did not. It lingered like a stain on the stones of the palace, like smoke in the rafters. The sisters had never reconciled. One had tried to kill the future. The other would never forget it. And now England belonged to Elizabeth. Her reign would begin with a coronation, but not of celebration. It was a coronation built upon bones. She was queen. But at what cost? She sat on the throne her sister left behind, a throne warmed by fire, cooled by ashes. Elizabeth was now Queen of England, but she did not smile. She understood too well the weight of a crown. It was not her sister's mercy that had saved her life, only hesitation. A single signature could have ended her, and yet Mary had let her live just long enough to see her fail. Elizabeth had watched her sister unravel, body bloated by false hope, limbs frail from heartbreak, her soul tormented by a faith she could never resurrect. The burnings had not purified England. They had scorched it. Now it was Elizabeth's turn. She was only 25, but she was no innocent. Her entire life had been shaped by suspicion, silence, and survival. And she would survive still, but not by becoming another Mary. No, she would never be her sister. She would be something else entirely. The court changed overnight. The incense of Catholic Mass faded. The crucifixes were tucked away. Latin prayers grew quiet. Elizabeth did not ban Catholicism with fire. She suffocated it with ceremony, with cold tolerance, with the cold reality that the future was Protestant and the past was dead. Her sister's ghost lingered in every chapel, every hollow corridor of the palace. Mary had left no heir, no legacy, only a warning. Never trust too deeply, never believe too blindly, never love too fiercely. Elizabeth's own body echoed that warning. She had learned from her sister's womb, its betrayals, its humiliations. Elizabeth declared herself married to her country, and no man would ever claim her as his. She knew too well what a marriage alliance could do, what it had done to Mary, to her mother Anne, to her grandmother Isabella. A queen, once wed, became a vessel, not a mind, and Elizabeth had too many minds to outwit. But even as she pulled away from the chains that had strangled Mary, she could not fully sever the tie. Mary haunted her. Every law Elizabeth passed had to reckon with the shadow of her sister's failures. Every sermon she permitted, every bishop she removed, every proclamation she penned. It was not just the future she was building. It was a rebuttal to what Mary had done. And yet, despite everything, there were moments, brief, tender, strange moments, when Elizabeth would sit in her private chambers and ask aloud whether Mary had truly hated her. The answer, of course, never came, but Elizabeth remembered the fear, the way Mary's eyes had once searched hers, dark and uncertain, like someone staring into a mirror they couldn't quite believe in. Their hatred had never been pure. It had been tangled with grief, with the loss of a father who had pitted them against one another before either of them had learned to speak. It had been shaped by men, by kings, by lords, by foreign ambassadors whispering about succession and bloodlines. Elizabeth had not stolen the throne from Mary, but she had been raised to replace her. The kingdom watched. The same people who had once cheered for Mary now placed their hopes in Elizabeth. But hope was a fragile thing, and so was trust. Elizabeth's court was laced with treachery. Catholic plots bloomed like mold in old bread. Jesuit priests snuck in through France and Flanders. Every few months there were whispers. Mary, Queen of Scots, was gathering allies. Spain was readying its fleet. Some nobleman had cursed the Queen and declared his allegiance to the Pope. Elizabeth's council begged her to act more decisively. Burn them, like Mary had. Execute the traitors without pause. But Elizabeth refused to become the monster the world expected. She ruled not with cruelty, but with calculation. Where Mary had struck out with desperation, Elizabeth sliced with subtlety. Arrests happened quietly, trials were swift, and sometimes people just vanished. She trusted no one, not her advisers, not her ladies, not even her own cousin Mary of Scots, whom she eventually imprisoned for nearly 2 decades. Elizabeth understood what Mary Tudor had never grasped. Power is not loud. It does not scream. It does not kneel to Rome, nor does it dance to Parliament. Power whispers, like a knife sliding from its sheath in the dark. And yet, power is also lonely. The palace grew colder as the years passed. Elizabeth never married. She surrounded herself with flatterers and spies. She laughed in public, but wept in private. At night, she often walked the halls alone, her footsteps echoing off stone floors worn smooth by centuries of blood and betrayal. Sometimes she would pause outside the old chapel where Mary once insisted on Mass. The door remained closed, but the memory did not. In her 33rd year as queen, Elizabeth fell seriously ill. Fever, vomiting, fainting spells. It echoed the same symptoms Mary had suffered. For a moment the court trembled. Would history repeat itself? Would England once again fall into chaos over succession? Elizabeth recovered, but the fear never left her. And in that moment of weakness, she whispered a name she had not spoken in years. Mary, not Mary of Scots. Mary, her sister. Had they been different women in another life, they might have protected one another. Elizabeth had no memory of being held by Mary, no recollection of kindness, but part of her longed to believe it had once happened. That before the suspicion, before the towers and interrogations and poisoned goblets, there had been a moment, just one, when they were sisters. But history is not built on moments. It is built on power. And Mary had failed. Elizabeth would not. She renewed her court's vigor. She commissioned portraits, images of herself as the eternal virgin, radiant and untouchable. She wove myths about her body, her beauty, her brilliance. She became a symbol. Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the Mother of England. And in every painting, in every poem, there was a subtext. I am not my sister. I am the cure to her disease. Yet the longer she ruled, the more the lines blurred. Elizabeth had survived the religious wars, yes, but by creating an iconography of herself that was just as rigid, just as consuming, just as false as Mary's faith. She may not have burned heretics, but she exiled them. She may not have married a foreign king, but she seduced entire nations with diplomacy. She may not have carried phantom pregnancies, but she gave birth to a myth so powerful it erased the truth beneath it. In the twilight of her reign, Elizabeth grew more fragile. Her hair thinned, her teeth blackened. Her gowns grew heavier, her makeup thicker, until she no longer resembled the woman who had once outwitted a nation. And still, she ruled. For decades she ruled. But her nights were haunted. Witnesses described her sleepwalking through the palace, whispering to herself. Sometimes she spoke to her father, sometimes to her mother, but more often to her sister. No one dared mention Mary aloud. It was dangerous to do so. The name itself was taboo, like a relic of a forgotten plague. But Elizabeth remembered. She remembered everything. And she feared that one day, when she too was gone, history would not distinguish between them. That they would both be remembered as lonely women, surrounded by men they could not trust, defined by choices they did not entirely make. One ruled with fire, the other with mirrors. And perhaps, in the end, the mirror cuts deeper. The fire had long since faded, but the embers still glowed in her bones. Elizabeth Tudor, Queen of England, Empress of the Seas, Mother of the Nation, was now an old woman. Her skin, once fair and commanding, had withered like parchment. Her breath came slow, drawn from lungs that had learned to hold silence better than any secret. And yet, no one dared call her old to her face. No one dared say the truth aloud, that the Queen was dying. She refused to sleep. For weeks she sat on cushions on the cold stone floor of Richmond Palace, cloaked in black, staring into nothing, speaking to no one. Her ladies-in-waiting, once chosen for their beauty and wit, had been reduced to shadows, silent, obedient, afraid. They whispered that the Queen would not change her clothes, would not eat, would not let the physicians near her. They said she kept vigil. But for what? They did not know. But Elizabeth knew. She was waiting for Mary. Not in flesh, for Mary had been gone over 40 years now. But Elizabeth felt her presence more keenly in death than she ever had in life. It was not her enemies she feared at the end. It was not Spain, nor the Pope, nor traitorous nobles in the north. It was the reckoning. The moment when all masks must fall and the sisters would meet again, stripped of their crowns and titles and guards, just women at last. She had once believed herself beyond that, above it, beyond guilt, beyond judgment. She was Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, anointed by God, preserved by Providence. But now the candlelight played tricks on the walls. Sometimes it flickered just so, and in the darkness she could almost hear a voice she had not heard since that stormy November morning in 1558, when the crown passed to her, heavy with failure, slick with the sweat of a dying queen. You will never be free of me. It was not a curse. It was a fact. In the last years of her reign, Elizabeth had kept up appearances. She danced at court, received ambassadors with stiff grace, recited witty verses, and adorned herself in pearls and powdered lead. But it was all theatre. Underneath, she unraveled. Her most trusted adviser, William Cecil, had died. Her last favourite, the young Earl of Essex, had betrayed her and been executed. She had no heir, no children, no family she could trust. Mary, Queen of Scots, her cousin, rival, and political mirror, had already met the axe years earlier, after Elizabeth had wavered, then relented. It haunted her too, but not like Mary Tudor did. Mary Tudor had been her sister in blood, the only one who had known what it was like to grow up under Henry's shadow, the only one who had seen their mothers' names whispered with scandal and shame, the only one who had stood on the other side of the fire and said, "You are the enemy." And perhaps she had been right. Elizabeth had rewritten the story. She had outlived them all. Her reign had brought stability, prosperity, and power to England. Her name was etched into gold coins and victory songs, and yet, in the final accounting of her soul, none of that mattered. Not when she was alone, not when the night deepened and no court musician could drown the voices that echoed through her memory. She had won. But what was left? She could no longer bear mirrors. The face they showed her was not her own. It was her mother's. Anne Boleyn, sharp-eyed and calculating. It was Mary's, heavy with sorrow, crowned with righteousness. It was Henry's, bloated with pride and cruelty. She saw them all in herself now. She saw a dynasty built not on love or legacy, but on fear. A family forged in fire and left to smolder. The courtiers began to circle. Parliament pushed her to name a successor, but she resisted. Naming one would mean conceding her end. She still ruled in name, but her voice cracked, her hands trembled. She barely moved from her seat of mourning. Some claimed she saw spirits, ghosts of the men she had executed, the lovers she had never truly loved, the children she had never borne. But the one she saw clearest was Mary. Sometimes she imagined her standing at the edge of her bedchamber, wearing the same black gown she had worn as queen, her eyes sunken, her lips tight. Not angry, not triumphant, just watching. Was it justice? Elizabeth did not know. She only knew that it was fitting. In 1603, as winter turned to spring, Elizabeth finally collapsed. She lay in her bed, draped in velvet, surrounded by the terrified and the loyal. But she spoke little. Her last hours were consumed by a kind of waking sleep, a half-conscious fever where past and present bled together. She whispered fragments, verses, names, regrets. But one name returned again and again, Mary. The physicians didn't know which one she meant. Perhaps not even Elizabeth did. Perhaps in her final delirium, all Marys became one. The mother she barely remembered, the cousin she condemned, the sister she never forgave. She died on March 24th, 1603. They buried her in Westminster Abbey, in a grand tomb of marble and gold. But there was one strange choice, one detail that few noticed. Elizabeth was not buried alone. She was laid to rest in the same vault as her sister, Mary Tudor, the woman who once tried to have her executed, the woman she had survived. Two queens, two sisters, two ghosts, now entombed together beneath the stone floor of England's holiest ground. And carved into the tomb was a single Latin inscription, Regno consorts and urna, hic obdormimus Elisabetha et Maria, sorores in spi resurrectionis, partners in throne and grave, here we sleep, Elizabeth and Mary, sisters, in hope of resurrection. But even stone lies. They had not been partners. They had been rivals, not merely in religion or politics, but in the deeper war between inheritance and defiance, between duty and identity. Each had tried to erase the other, and in doing so, erased something of themselves. History would remember Elizabeth as the greater queen, the glorious, the wise, the beloved. Mary would be remembered as the bloody, the fanatic, the tragic. But neither title told the truth. Both were daughters of a tyrant. Both were women in a world that devoured women. And both, in the end, had ruled as men ruled, with fire and fear, with sacrifice and silence. Centuries later, visitors to Westminster still walk past their tomb. They rarely notice the names, the inscription faded with time, but if they listened closely, if they stood in stillness, they might hear something. Not a scream, not a cry, just the sound of breathing. Two sisters, still waiting, still watching, still bound. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.